Hello, I am PBS NewsHour student reporter Julia Escobar from Venice High School. Today I have the honor of speaking with Dr. Thomas Insel. Dr. Insel has served as the director for the National Institute of Mental Health for over a decade and has co-founded mental health startups such as MindStrong and Humanist. In 2019, he was appointed as a special advisor to the California Governor, Gavin Newsom, as the acting mental health czar of California. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Insel.
Hey, it's a pleasure, Julia. I'm looking forward to having a chance to chat with you.
How are you doing today? How is the life of Dr. Insel currently?
This has been a day of Zoom, and I have to say, there are better ways to live than being on one Zoom call after another. But we're in that period of the pandemic where it's still social distance, and trying to get things done requires connecting by internet. So I'm looking forward to actually having sometime this week to get outside and enjoy something that's not on a screen.
Are you based in California or where are you at right now?
I live and work from my home in Northern California in the East Bay. So I'm just outside of the town of Pleasanton, California, which is in Alameda County, about an hour east of Palo Alto. And we live in a kind of rural area with lots of farms around here, vineyards and horse farms, and um, probably more animals than people in this neighborhood.
That's very cool. Okay. We know that more than 75% of mental health issues can develop before the age of 24. And there are well documented healthcare disparities across race and income when it comes to access to healthcare and mental health care. What do you think can be done to make sure youth of color and low income youth have the access to mental health care that they need?
Well, Julia, I'm not sure that the solution's entirely one of access. I think that in some ways, a bigger problem is engagement. Even when there is access available, a lot of young people don't want it. They don't, I mean, to put it kind of bluntly, as a mental health person, I'd have to say that they're not buying what we're selling. And part of that is that they don't see themselves in the care system. And I think if we're really serious about trying to make a difference, we have to shift from asking how do they get access to asking how do they get engaged? What makes it for them worth engaging in care? And so there, I think it helps to have a workforce that they can relate to, and tools and opportunities that they can relate to, giving them agency, empowering them, thinking about solutions, not just defining problems. There's a whole bunch of things we can do. Technology can help us a little bit, but what will be really useful is for them to have um, to be able to see people that look like them, that they can relate to, that understand the world that they're coming from. And right now, that's not really what the care system looks like.
What barriers have you seen when it comes to addressing youth mental health and well-being, particularly young people who come from non-white and low-income communities?
Um, yeah, there are a bunch of barriers to getting really good care, and they start with the the fact that we've got such a fragmented, difficult system to navigate. I mean, it's really hard to even figure out where you should go and who you should see. And often there's a long waiting list in the public system, often in the private commercial system where a lot of people would get care. There's no one available. So it's really whether you're a young person or an older person, it's not a great system. It wasn't really built for consumers. It was built for payers and providers, and it's tough to navigate. So that's a huge barrier. Um, I would have to say that even beyond care, what is I think unfortunate in the way we think about mental health is that usually people end up getting care when they're in crisis, and where we want to move our whole system is to engaging earlier and getting to people before they get into a crisis so they don't end up in a crisis. Nobody wants and nobody should get care for the first time in an emergency room. Not ideal. Not a place where you're likely to get the problems solved that are most important. So, thinking about how do you provide opportunities for young people earlier in their journey? Maybe that would be in school, maybe it'd be in a community center of some sort. Maybe it's because there are access points for families. Maybe there's tools online that people can learn from. So I think there are lots of ways to do this that are better than what we tend to do now.
Since you've started your career in the medical field and in mental health care, have you noticed any changes in how young people view mental health?
Well, you hear a lot about people, talk about stigma and the fact that there is a kind of negative attitude towards people with mental problems, whether you call those disorders or illnesses or whatever, however you want to lay that out. I think there's less of that in young people than there was in the past, and certainly less of an issue for young people and their attitudes than there would have been than what we see in their parents. So I think in general, um, we're at a time where most young people are more accepting of diversity, including neurodiversity, including people who may think and act and behave differently than they do. That's a really wonderful thing to see. Having said that, I think there's still a problem with negative attitudes towards treatment. Not everybody understands that we have very effective treatments, psychotherapies, sometimes medication, a range of recovery-based treatments that are really helpful. And there tends to be, for young people and older people, a tendency to dismiss that and to either neglect it or to actually have a kind of negative bias, thinking that, well, like treatments for diabetes might be really good, treatments for depression are probably not. The fact is they're equally effective, and there are plenty of choices of different kinds of treatment. And we have to overcome that kind of negative attitude, that kind of stigma for us to really be able to offer the most help to people who need it.
Do you think people's attitudes towards medicating mental health comes from a place of not being educated about it or from being scared to medicate mental like invisible illnesses?
Yeah, let me pull you out on that question a little bit, Julia, because I think that's a really interesting problem. And we know that most young people, and actually the population in general, they're more reluctant to take medications for a mental problem than they would be for most physical problems. And you've sort of posited two possibilities. Maybe they don't know enough, or maybe they just don't want to mess with their minds or their brains. I'd be curious what you think and what you see amongst your peers. How do they respond to the medication question?
I think amongst my peers and in my experience with speaking to students who are on medication for their mental health issues, I think they feel a difference, and I think it's, like, very empowering for them to know that what they are doing or, like, what they have advocated for, like, through the healthcare system and getting help is actually helping them. But I think when it comes to parents or teachers or, I guess, older generations who don't always validate invisible illnesses, I think when it comes to talking to them about it, it's very well, obviously taboo and there's like a stigma around it, but I think they just don't understand that it can be very helpful to be put on medication and that it actually does make a difference and like you can't get addicted to it or I actually don't really know that, but I assume if you are giving like a 15-year-old a medication, they can't get addicted to it the same way they can if it's another medication. But you can correct me on that if that's wrong. I think it's different I think students are much more susceptible to understanding it than older generations because I think older generations have I kind of see like an implicit bias. They don't feel it's real. They don't think it's going to work, so they don't want to put like chemicals inside like their child's body. So I think there is a very
Hmm.
large difference.
So if I guess we're talking about drugs like Ritalin or stimulant drugs or drugs like an antidepressant or something like that, you would find that your friends would be more likely and more willing to take those medications than maybe their parents or their teachers would. That's very interesting, and I guess helpful for me to hear. Do you think that's because they're just less concerned about risk, or they're more willing to just consider that what they're dealing with is like a physical problem and just should be treated medically?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think some students, or at least some of my friends around me, get to a point where like nothing else has worked. Like they've done therapy for 5 years. They've gone to different retreats or rehabs, and nothing works.
So that's a really great way to put it. So it's like this is one more opportunity to try to feel better, and if other things haven't worked so well, maybe this is worth trying. What I've been pushing for a lot more is that we not think about medication or therapy or groups, but we try to combine all of these things. And we recognize that we've got lots of solutions. They don't all work for each person, but some of them will work for most people, and combining them will work for even more people. So we tend in the care system, it tends to be one at a time. You go to a doctor to get a medication, you go to a counselor to get therapy. So they tend to get separated out. But in the real world, I mean, if you're asking for one of your friends, what's going to be most useful? It's probably going to be putting a lot of things together. We do that actually for diabetes, but we don't do it so much for depression and anxiety, and we need to. But it's interesting to me to hear that you find that students are more willing to take medication than their parents might have been, and I suspect, though I don't really know this, I suspect it's because um, they've grown up in a world in which they realize that medicines can be made safe and effective, and that for this set of problems, you don't have to tough it out. You don't have to suffer. It's actually worth getting treatment and getting treatment earlier so that these things don't grow into massive problems.
Since you were the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, based on your experiences, what are the changes you would like to see in our healthcare system overall and then specifically related to youth?
Oh, I really like that question, and I'm not sure I really understood it when I was at the National Institute of Mental Health, but I've done a lot of traveling through California since then, and had a chance to meet people in homeless shelters and clubhouses and places that unfortunately include jails and prisons, and heard from a lot of people struggling with mental health issues that are not in the care system. And I began to realize that, there's a difference between mental health and mental health care. That in a way, mental health care is like where it's like the repair shop, right? It's where the equivalent would be if you had the metaphor of your car. It's you take the car into the repair shop when it breaks down. But what we really ought to be thinking about is how do you make sure the highways are really working well for people? So it's that mental health itself has much less to do with the repair shop and much more to do with uh, creating all of those things in the world that allow people to function well. So making sure that, like we were just talking about, in terms of if you think about what's useful to people, that you don't wait until there's a crisis to intervene. You make sure that people who are struggling have access to peers and to providers who can be useful. You think about what I call the three P's: um, people, place, and purpose. That's really the essence of what you're going to need for mental health. People being that you've got friends, you've got social support, you've got somebody watching your back. Places that you've got some place safe, free of toxic stress, free of a lot of the challenges that come with poverty and racism and social injustice. And then purpose is super important, particularly for young people, that they realize that they have a mission, they have something to live for. It's such a critical piece. Nietzsche once said that the person who has a why can bear almost any how. So having a reason, um, having something to live for, something that you care about, you're passionate about. And what I'd love to see as we go forward is that even though we think about these problems kind of from a medical perspective, because in fact they are medical in the sense that we expect health insurance to support their solutions. The actual solutions are not medical. So the problem is medical, but the solutions are social, they're environmental, they're political, there are a whole bunch of other things that we need to have in the mix for mental health to prevail. It's much more than just traditional mental health care.
How do you think workspaces in schools and spaces where youth and students are spending a lot of their time, how do you think those institutions can create the 3 Ps, like people, place, and yeah,
Purpose. Yeah.
purpose?
Well,
Thank you.
schools are really ground zero for so much of this because that's where you guys are going to be and so much of the time. And I think there is a way that, in the same way we were so focused on physical education and physical fitness, we can begin to think of schools as a place where people learn uh, emotional regulation, mindfulness, all the tools for mental fitness as well. And those three P's become part of what schools get involved with. I'm not saying that schools should be mental health clinics because it's not that, but that schools begin to recognize that um, it's just as important to be mentally fit as physically fit, and they can begin to create opportunities to do that. In other countries, they've gotten really good at this. Australia has a program I love called the Future Proofing Project in Sydney. The entire state of New South Wales, which is where Sydney is, has said, we're going to really invest in the mental fitness of our high school students. And so there they have everything from courses in mindfulness and in emotional regulation and in figuring out about emotional growth. But as well, every student has a equivalent of a Fitbit, and they have an app on their phone which tracks a whole bunch of different features of how they sleep and how much time they're spending on a screen and how social they are and even looks at things like are their texts filled with positive sentiment or are they getting really negative and hostile and all those issues and giving the students feedback, empowering them with information about their own mental fitness in a really good way. If they need it, the future proofing project can link them to care, but most students don't want it and don't need it. But it's part of your education. It's part of learning about how to manage your mind in the same way that we learn so much about how to manage our physical fitness. America's been slow. We've been late to the party on this, and we can learn from how it's been done in other countries. But the opportunities there, the technology's ready. It just requires a certain willingness to start to recognize that this is important and we can do it, and we need to do it for mental well-being.
Who do you think or how do you think we are like the US is going to get there? Because like you said, we have the technology and we have a lot of the resources, but we don't have the push to put them out. What do you think, or who do you think needs to be a part of that to make it nationally known, or to make it accessible, or to make it available?
Well, we need a social movement. So the answer to who is you. It's social movements never work from the top down. They only work from the bottom up. It takes people like you who care about this issue to spread the message, motivate others, and create not just awareness, but action to say, hey, we need this course in our school. Hey, we need to make sure we don't lose another student to suicide. There are things we can do to make sure that doesn't happen. It's not going to happen from administrators and teachers and governments. It's partly because they're just so busy with other stuff, and this isn't top of mind for them. So, you guys, you and others have got to sort of pick the mantle up and really run with it. We need a social movement. You can think a lot about the civil rights movement, which is a wonderful model for what we need here. In the civil rights movement, people didn't talk about stigma; they talked about discrimination. They didn't talk about access; they talked about rights and equality and equity. And that's the language we need. We need to shift our language so that we're really fighting for something here that ensures that students get what they deserve, and that we start to say, hey, you know what? Mental wellness, mental fitness is every bit as important as physical fitness. We invest an awful lot in our football teams and our basketball teams, but what about those teams that are supporting each other, our peers? What about people who are just going to commit to make sure we won't lose another student to suicide. We won't lose another student to dropping out of school. Mental disorders, mental issues are the number one reason why students drop out. They don't graduate in terms of medical issues. Number one. So we've got to undo that. And when I say we, it's all of us. It's not going to happen from the government. It's not going to happen from the administration. It's going to happen when we create this movement and students begin to demand it.
Are there any resources or guidance you can share for young people to looking to address their mental health challenges?
Yeah, there's lots of stuff to read, and there's lots available on the web, and so I'm going to shamelessly push one of my own companies called Humanest Care, which is about exactly what we've been talking about, empowering people to help each other. Humanest, used to be called Nest Health, but we broadened it to be Humanest, is an example of the kind of tool based here on technology that it really focuses on self-help, on community, on those 3 Ps, on really trying to give people those in a fashion that lets them overcome all kinds of adversity. But there are many examples of that. I think you can find a lot on the web. Not all of it's great, um, but there are resources there um, for self-help as well as for helping each other. It's also going to be, I think, helpful if you can create within a school kind of focus on this to ensure you're getting something of high quality, and it's something that you can begin to share with others and share experiences with others. Just being able to talk about some of these issues, which have been hard to talk about in the past, just talking about it is by itself very empowering. Good place to start. In terms, I was just talking about the importance of having a social movement. I think in terms of doing that, it's so great to study the history of the civil rights movement. That's the model for what we need here. Understanding how do people begin to achieve inclusion and equity? What does that require? What are the steps that matter, and how do you organize, and how do you uh, how do you include people who might feel like they don't have a role or they don't know what to do? So I definitely recommend learning from history.
What led you to a career in mental health?
Oh, I had gone to medical school at a really early age. I was kind of one of these Doogie Howser characters. I don't know if that's a name you would know, but that was a popular show of a kid who was a doctor before he was shaving, and I was kind of like that. I was very young. When I came out of medical school, I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I just knew I didn't wanna work really hard because I worked so hard to get to that point. So I just needed a respite. So I didn't want to become a surgeon or an internist, and I didn't really get that interested in pathology. So the only choice left was psychiatry, which was less work. And I didn't know much about it. But as I started to get into it, I got really interested in people's stories. I just got fascinated by listening to people's stories and recognizing that just being with someone and sharing their pain could be therapeutic. No one had ever taught me that. I thought you needed to give medication or you needed to do surgery. And just the idea that you could accompany somebody, you know, and in that process and in that relationship, help them through a very tough time, help them to grow and help them to move forward in their lives. I just found that very exciting. And it's still exciting 50 years later. I never stop being kind of amazed at how people find within themselves the keys to solutions to overcoming so much of what they feel before they felt they couldn't solve. And yet they find the solutions within. But sometimes they need someone alongside, somebody who can help them face this shoulder to shoulder to be able to do it. And that having that opportunity, given that having people let you come into their lives to do that is such a gift. It's such a special experience. So I was really swept away by that. And then later just got swept away by the complexity of the brain and neuroscience. So I spent most of my life trying to understand how does the brain work. Two really interesting questions. How do people overcome adversity and how does the brain work? I don't think we've gotten answers on either one of them, but that's what makes it exciting is it's still worth trying to figure those problems out.
What have you learned about yourself through listening to other people's stories and just being there for them?
Well, I've learned humility. I've learned that nobody's an expert, and that um, humility by itself can be empowering, and it's a very good place to come from. You don't have to have all the answers. Sometimes you just have to listen and just have to be patient and willing to learn, and that can take you a long way. So it's um, it's important, I think, to when we were talking before about the three P's in finding a purpose to recognize that helping others and being in a world and a life of service, whether that's in healthcare or in social service or anything else, is empowering. It's highly, highly invigorating and inspiring to be in a world where you work really hard to help other people.
Going back a little bit, we were talking about access and access to mental health care. And you even touched on a little bit about how it is about having students see themselves within the system and being heard and understood, even when they don't want to necessarily get mental health care. But for people of color, from personal experience and youth of color, specifically people who come from immigrant backgrounds, there's a shame about like asking for help. And like there's just this overall misunderstanding about mental health within the immigrant community, and you can be an advocate and like a scholar of mental health and create those resources the way you have. But it's ultimately like the community or like the purpose and like the place you are with the people you are closest with that make you feel like you are worthy of those resources. Um, what can like be done to make sure that like youth feel that they are important and they should have access or they should go get mental health care and also have different people be proactive about them getting help?
I'd love to turn that question back to you, not because psychiatrists tend to answer questions with questions, but because you're in that world and I'm not. And so I just love to know what you've thought about and what you think would be most helpful, because that's probably much closer to the right answer than whatever I could come up with.
I have a question before I answer that question. Do you think more students need to be or young people need to be a part of the process of making mental health resources or seeing themselves within it? Like, do you consult sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole movement called the peer movement, and the peer movement is all about using your lived experience to help others, and recognizing that we're all experts based on our own experience. So, what an opportunity to sort of help somebody who may be from the same community and who may also have struggled with that sense that you talked about of shame or blame and being feeling like this is taboo. Somebody who's been through that and who has had to experience the difficulty, super important. They become part of the team, and they're really one of the ways in which um, again people begin to recover because they feel like they've got someone they can connect with. But I'm not going to let you off the hook because we only have a few minutes, so I want to make sure I hear from you about, like, what is it for people of color, people from underserved communities, people who are in cultures where they don't tend to ask for help for emotional problems? How do we get past that? What do you think would be most useful for them?
I think it comes down to having parents knowledgeable about mental health because especially with social media and young people having access to like phones and computers, I think a lot of students are aware that they have a mental health issue or they see it in other people like on social media and they can relate to it. So they do know what it's like or like the feelings of having like a mental health issue. But in getting that help, you need parent consent or you need to like well, I don't know if you actually need parent consent, but if you wanna go to therapy, if you wanna get medicated, I'm assuming if you're a minor, you need to have some, like, form of, like, adult consent, correct? I could be wrong. I don't wanna say anything wrong.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. Unless you're over 18.
Yes. So a lot of students or youth know they have this issue and know there is treatments to help them, whether that's like therapy or medication, but it's their family that's like, no, you you don't have this, like you don't need to be medicated, like you don't need to go to therapy, like you're not crazy. And then that like begins like an internal like, oh, well, like, am I like I'm not valid kind of like feeling. So I think it should come down to like educating parents or guardians or having admin or like teachers like advocate for students in that process because at least in my experience, like I spend a lot of time with my teachers when I'm physically in school because I'm like a part of a lot of different clubs and organizations. So like sometimes like my teachers know something about me like my parents don't know. And it's not bad. It's just I spend so much time with them and they're like in a classroom with me in situations where like I'm around certain people, so I act a certain way. Um so I think having like parents more educated or more open about mental health treatment, I think is probably like one of the most impactful resources that can be done, and it's hard because like parents with like immigrant backgrounds, they don't like to talk about it. Like they like to think that like everything's okay because they've had to like go through a lot of really hard experiences and they've had to kind of like hold it in. So I think they kind of just expect that from their kids, and it's not always great because it leads to like their kids not feeling important, and then that leads to a lot of other issues down the road.
I think that's a great answer, and because it gives you a target. It says, let's start by educating parents, and you could do that through the school system. You can do that on social media. You can do that in lots of ways. And you're probably right. A lot of parents have learned to suck it up and learned to just put things aside and not deal with some serious problems which actually could have been dealt with, and a lot of that pain that could have been relieved. And they want the best for their kids. They're not doing it out of being selfish. They're doing it because it's just an uncomfortable topic. So giving them the space and the place and giving them the education, it's a great idea and a great opportunity. Hey, Julia, it has been a delight to talk to you. You've obviously got great ideas about things we all need to learn about. So, as often say, everybody's an expert here, in the real sense that everybody has lived experience. And so, I just hope you can take that lived experience and use it to benefit not only yourself, but lots of other people who really can use the kind of wisdom that you've already developed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Insel. Thank you for giving me the confidence in my lived experience. I don't always hear that from adults. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.